In the previous chapter, I tried to convince you about the importance of an innovation system. Here in this chapter, I want to give you an example of a company that may or may not use one. So the purpose of this chapter is to conduct a thought experiment about a company that we all admire. So what company do you admire? How about Auchan, the French retailer? Coca-Cola, one of the greatest brands in the world? General Motors, Google, Haier, the great Chinese appliance manufacturer? Kimberly-Clark, IBM, Netflix. How about Nike? Novotel, Reliance, one of the most valuable companies now in India. Southwest Airlines, a pioneer in the American airline industry. Starbucks, Tata Group, one of India's most respected companies. Total Oil, one of the largest oil companies in the world. Toyota, or Toyota Scion, their American branch. How about Uber, or how about the humanitarian work of UNICEF? I'm listing these particular companies because we have case studies on all of them throughout this course. But there's a particular company that we also admire quite a lot, and that's Apple. And in this case, we're going to look at the innovation system of Apple. Steve Jobs maintained that there was no innovation system at Apple. This is a quote from a book by Leander Kane called Inside Steve's Brains. Great book. Provided us with a lot of valuable insights about Apple. But I want to test what Jobs said by looking at Apple and what they do. So perhaps we should start with a question of why. Why does Apple innovate? Well, of course, it's to create competitive advantage. And the particular strategy of Apple is based on disruption. So a part of this story relates to 1997, the year that Steve Jobs came back to Apple. If you remember the history, Jobs and Steve Wozniak established the company. It grew very, very quickly, and they needed to bring in additional experienced managers, more senior people. They brought in John Sculley from PepsiCo to be the CEO, but it turned out that Jobs and Sculley didn't get along very well. There was a power struggle, and Jobs left Apple and started a new company called Next. Well, after a number of years and a number of CEOs, Apple was on the downturn, and by 1997, the board of directors was desperate, and they asked Jobs to come back and take over leadership of the company again. So let's imagine that it's 1997. We're Steve Jobs. Here we come back to the organization. What's our strategy? What are we going to do? How are we going to reinvigorate Apple? How are we going to turn it into a force for disruption? Well, in order to develop an innovation strategy, we have to understand the history of our industry. So we can divide the PC industry history into these three eras. First of all, it was making stuff. That was personal productivity, era one. Then with the internet, we connected our computers and began to communicate. And then in era three, we began to use the computer to buy things. So that brings us to 1997. What is era four going to be? What should Apple's strategy be for the future from 1997 onwards? Well, Jobs and his team did a lot of research, and they looked for the patterns of what was going on. And they began to observe how much stuff was being done digitally that hadn't been done digitally before. And they recognized that the digital lifestyle was emerging throughout the world, that people were adopting digital technology to do all kinds of things. What they realized was that if they could connect all of these digital devices to a hub, which at that time would have been a Macintosh computer, that their strategy was for the Mac to be the digital hub. So we'd connect our cameras, we'd connect our video cameras, our scanners, our internet connected devices. We'd use the Mac for Wi-Fi, for storing our photographs. So that became the core of Apple's strategy from 1997 onwards, to assure that the Mac was the digital hub, recognizing that we were shifting to a digital lifestyle and an era of co-creation where people were starting to create large quantities of information to share digitally. So that would be the strategy, the why, the larger macroeconomic picture, the picture of evolving technology and the picture of evolving society. So given that, what then should Apple do? Well, one of the most important things that Jobs did in his first few years was he simplified the Apple portfolio of computers. When he had rejoined the company, there was a broad mix in the product line, but it really didn't make a lot of sense, and there wasn't a clear development pathway, nor was there a pathway for consumers to upgrade from one model to the next. And so by 2001, Jobs had simplified the product portfolio down to 2 desktops and 2 portable units. But of course, his intent and the intent of the company was to expand that portfolio. So Apple pursued a portfolio innovation strategy. And as you can see, by 2011, they had added iTunes, iPod, iPhone, and iPad. It was the iFamily. So the iFamily portfolio expanded Apple's reach into many, many new markets. And what do we see by 2021? Well, Apple continues to expand its portfolio. It has the watch, it has CarPlay, it has major initiative in health, it has Apple TV, and who knows what's coming next. Certainly something will be coming soon. By the time you watch this chapter, maybe you already know what goes where the question marks are, but when I'm recording it, we don't know yet, so it's just a matter of interesting speculation. So how does all this play out in the stock market? Well, when Jobs returned as CEO in 1997, this is the Apple stock chart, you can see that investors were very unimpressed. Jobs' return made no impact at all on investor sentiment. So the company continued on at a relatively low stock valuation. But as the years went by, things began to change. So the internet boom and then bust appeared. Apple opened its retail stores. They released the iPod. And as you can see from the stock chart, none of those things really had a major impact on the stock price, other than the internet boom, and that lifted all tech companies, but then they all fell back when the boom turned into a bust. So there's a big boom in the Apple stock on the right side of the chart starting around 2005. But so far, the initiatives that we've talked about haven't achieved that. They haven't resulted in much growth at all. So the question is, for us, what was it that happened in the 2004-2005 timeframe that led to such amazing growth in the stock value? We know it was not the iPhone because that came later. That was 2007. So let's zoom in a little closer and see if we can see what's going on here. The iTunes Store, well, it wasn't really that either. iTunes was a new business model for Apple and a very interesting one. It took them into selling services, selling music, as opposed to selling hardware and software. So a significant innovation for the company and really hugely successful. People all over the world realized that iTunes was a much better music organizer than anything they had available to them before. So a significant success for Apple, but not enough to change investor sentiment in a big way. But this brings up an interesting question. What is a business model? Business model innovation is a very important topic in the innovation universe. In fact, it's so important that we'll have an entire section on it later on. You'll see some of these slides then. And in fact, you'll see many of the slides from this chapter throughout other chapters of this course, because they touch on other topics that are very important that we'll delve into in more detail. With respect to a business model, what do we mean? Well, at a basic level, it's how you make money. But more importantly, it's how you deliver experiences to your customers. It's also how you deliver products and services, the technology, the supply chain, how you organize your operations. And in the end, perhaps the most important, it's how you differentiate. So with iTunes, Apple had a new way to make money, a new way to provide experiences to customers, an entirely new operation to organize, and a significant differentiator. But still, iTunes apparently wasn't the factor that led to that explosive growth in its market value. So what was it? Well, as it turns out, it was iTunes, but it was the version of iTunes that was released for the PC. That was the breakthrough in Apple's business model. Let's explain why that was such a breakthrough and how it evolved. In 2003, before iTunes, Apple was a niche computer company. Microsoft was the dominant player in the industry with Windows and the Office suite. It had about 95% market share, whereas Apple was a niche player with about 5% market share. So Apple was living in a protected universe, a separate universe, not able to access the larger market base, the much larger market base that Microsoft had. By releasing iTunes for the PC, what did Apple do? Well, it began to colonize the Microsoft ecosystem. So in 2003, they moved inside. By 2004, Apple was inside the Microsoft ecosystem with iTunes and still with its own ecosystem as well. And then the company grew very quickly, and pretty soon, by 2015, Apple had caught Microsoft. They had grown to be nearly equal in value, and over the years, they alternate as to which company, or maybe one or two others, is the most valuable company in the world, but they're two in the top 5 for sure. But that never would have happened if Apple had remained in its secluded, sequestered universe. It was only when Apple joined, in a sense, Microsoft by releasing iTunes for the PC that it really began to experience that explosive growth potential. And then, of course, 2007 comes the iPhone, a breakthrough innovation, which leads to a completely new market structure. We saw that very sad photograph of the Nokia CEO crying on the day when he announced that Nokia was being sold to Microsoft. That was the end of Nokia as an independent company. A tragedy for Nokia, a triumph for Apple. That's what breakthrough innovations do. They change the market structure. They are disruptions. So in a sense, it took Jobs from 1997 to 2007 to engineer a major disruption. And it's that disruption, of course, that has catapulted Apple to being one of the most valuable corporations in the world and one of the most admired. So the iPhone is a platform. It's a breakthrough innovation and a business model innovation. It's a platform in the sense that there are all those apps that run on it, and the apps are made by independent third parties. So in fact, the iPhone is just the means through which independent software developers bring their services to the market on the iPhone. In that sense, a platform technology provides Apple with tremendous leverage. And in fact, iTunes is also an example of a platform technology, because of course, Apple isn't writing and recording all that music. They're just providing a way for artists to get their music into the marketplace. The App Store is the same thing. It's a new business model. It's a way for Apple to make money, but it's also a way for thousands and hundreds of thousands of software developers to make money as well. Many of them do very well. They make huge amounts of money because the Apple ecosystem, the Apple customer ecosystem is so huge. Millions of people download their apps, and millions of people times a few dollars adds up very nicely for a software developer. So why does business model innovation matter so much? Well, what do these companies have in common? Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Alibaba, and Tencent in China? Well, they're all business model innovators. They've all transformed how we live because they offer a different business model, a different type of experience. But Apple doesn't just do breakthrough innovation. They don't do just business models. They also do incremental innovation. So look at this history of the iPhone from 2007 to 2017. Each of these generational changes represents a relatively small step forward, little improvements, one after another, changing the form factor a little bit, the size, improving the processor, improving the glass, improving the batteries. The iPhone of 2017 is a far, far different device than the iPhone of 2007, and yet it's entirely recognizable. It's the same family, just performing much better because of all those incremental improvements. So incremental improvement, incremental innovation is all about increasing market share. Apple's engaged in an intense market share warfare with Samsung and Android, with Google, with other smartphone manufacturers, and making these improvements in cameras, in the performance, in the glass, in the size. These are all competitive factors that Apple must do to remain competitive in the marketplace. So we've talked about three different types of innovation so far. We've talked about breakthroughs, we've talked about new business models, and we've talked about incremental innovation. There's a fourth type of innovation as well. We call that new venture innovation. And we think that Apple must be cooking up some kind of a new venture. It would make sense at this stage in the company's development that it would have a new venture, perhaps in automotive, perhaps in transportation more generally, perhaps in healthcare. We don't know what it's going to be. Apple remains quite secretive. But again, by the time you look at this chapter, you may know. As of today, when I'm recording it, we don't know. But these four types are the four types. And as we get further into the chapters in this course, you'll learn more about them in great detail. And you'll see many, many examples of how various companies apply all four types of innovation to increase their success, to increase their competitive advantage, to augment their strength in the marketplace. So that's the what of innovation, the innovation portfolio. What about the how? How does Apple innovate? Well, one of the keys to innovation at Apple is its obsession with design. So here's the introduction of a new product. Perhaps you recognize it. It's the MacBook Air. Someone's holding it up at a public display for the first time to show it off. Well, who would that be? Well, of course, that would be the one who is the design obsessive at Apple, or was. That's Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was well known for his obsession with design and for driving the company to improve its design generation after generation, incrementally as well as through breakthroughs, continuing to push to make the usability of its devices better and better, but also their pure aesthetics. So going back a few years, when they introduced the first Macintosh, they knew they didn't want it to look like a, quote, traditional computer, unquote. They didn't want it to be a steel box. For inspiration, Jobs went shopping at a department store. He went to the kitchen section and noticed this Cuisinart and said to himself, well, wouldn't it be great if we could make the Macintosh look like the Cuisinart? Sure enough, that's what they did. They wanted it to be a friendly device, something you'd put on the counter in your kitchen, something that would be a friend to the family, not a techie thing that went down in the basement. Another inspiration for another Apple product, a sunflower, and a desktop Mac that looks like a sunflower. And yet a third, how could an Apple product look like a stick of gum? Well, one of the early iPod Nanos did. Turned out it wasn't a very successful product in the marketplace, but it was a beautiful example of excellent design, and it enabled Apple to learn a lot from a design and engineering standpoint. Of course, we know how well designed the Apple stores are and how unique they are. Simply no other retailer in the world had ever dared to imagine that a computer store could be so beautiful. And Jobs understood that one of his key roles was making it possible for this great design to happen. So he said, I have to create space for the people who are doing the great work to do the great work. I have to keep the organization out of their hair. Andy Hertzfeld, one of the legendary software programmers from the early Macintosh days, said exactly the same thing. He said, Steve was like a giant umbrella. He protected us, again, so we could do our best work. Our best work as what? As designers, of course. Now, early on, Apple realized that the computer user interface was critical to its success, and so it began to publish books on user interface design, and software developers were expected to follow these guidelines. The one on the left from 1987, the one on the right from the 1990s. I still have my copy of the 1987 book, and it's a wonderful reference. It says a great deal about Apple's philosophy, about its commitment to providing the very best end user experience. Today, it's still committed to human interface guidelines. Now, of course, they're not published in a book, they're available online. And all developers can refer to these pages to understand how to create a uniform customer experience, a uniform user experience across all these different Apple devices. Apple takes design so seriously that they design their packaging with great intention as well. In fact, they have a packaging design lab at their headquarters in Cupertino because they want the experience of opening an Apple box, of opening an Apple product, to be a learning experience for the user. So opening the box, taking out the various parts and pieces, that's part of the learning experience, understanding how they fit together, and by the way, understanding how carefully they're designed and how carefully the experience of opening the package is curated. All this design work, well, it follows through based on a lot of prototyping. So when they were developing the first iPod, for example, they were developing a new software interface. No one had ever designed an interface for a music device like the one they envisioned. And it took a lot of prototypes to get it right. In fact, at one point, they were prototyping a new version every day. So they were in a rapid prototyping cycle of demo, learn, test, reprogram, demo again, learn, test again, reprogram again. One prototype per day over hundreds of design cycles. That reflects a very deep commitment to design and to the customer's experience. Now, senior management is involved in all these design cycles as well. So Monday is called Review Day at Apple, where senior leaders participate in the design process. That's how they guide the process and also understand what their designers are thinking about, what new innovations are coming along. So we could say that Apple's design obsession is, in a sense, a rigorous prototyping and testing process. The core of Apple's innovation process is prototyping and testing. That's what they do. And they do it with great intensity and with great results, if you're an Apple fan like I am, as you can tell. They also engage in very active market development. Do you recognize this image? This is from the 1984 commercial that launched the Macintosh. It was shown on TV only once during the Super Bowl, but it became an icon for Apple as a rebel brand. And it said, Apple's here in a new way with Macintosh, in a big way. Well, Steve Jobs understood the importance of marketing. He said, my dream is that every person will have an Apple. With the iPhone now, he's getting pretty close to realizing that dream. And he said, to do that, we've got to be a great marketing company. That's why he recruited John Sculley, a marketing expert, to join the organization. Sculley became CEO. And he said, what's our secret formula? It's great technology and great marketing. If you make the best product in the world and people don't know about it, then it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. And that's why they started the Apple Store. They wanted the store to be the best buying experience for computers. The Apple Store was actually inspired by Nike. Nike had established its Nike Town stores because Nike wasn't happy with how its products were being retailed in generalized sporting goods stores. Apple had the same awareness. They said, we don't like how our stuff is represented in computer stores. Maybe we should open our own stores. Well, when the first Apple Store opened, it was ridiculed by the retail community. Many of the so-called experts said, well, This will last a few months. Apple will close these stores. They're certain to fail. But those people, it turned out, were wrong, and Apple's vision was right, because the experience of being a customer in an Apple store was a very, very good experience. There was free tech support. There was great customer service. There was a beautiful environment. And so what had Apple done with its stores? It had removed friction. There's a lot of friction in the process of buying many products and services. And Apple designed the Apple Store to get rid of as much friction as possible. We'll have an entire chapter on friction because this theme is so important for the success of your innovations. Here's the Apple Store on Fifth Avenue. We saw before Apple stores in Hong Kong and Shanghai. These are beautiful buildings, recognizable instantly anywhere around the world. Inside the store, Apple pioneered many new levels of customer experience. For example, the Apple Store never had a cash register. You never had to wait in line to pay for your product because the person who helped you in the store, that person had a portable cash register. You just took care of it right there. They'd reach under the table, print out a receipt, give it to you, put it in a bag, and away you'd go. So those are some key elements of the Apple innovation process. The design obsession, the idea that buying the product ought to be a pleasure. It should be a learning experience. It should be in a beautiful environment. The idea that marketing is critical to the success of a technology company. All elements of Apple's core innovation process. What about the people at Apple? What about the innovation culture? Here's a quote from Jonathan Ive, who was at the time the designer of the iPod and later became the senior designer responsible for all design at Apple. He said, "We work at Apple with a level of collaboration that's quite rare. And the way we work as a team, that's really what's important." And that's exactly what we mean by the innovation culture. It's not only a different type of work following a better innovation process, but it's a different human process as well. Another comment also from Jonathan Ive, he says, one of the hallmarks of our team is inquisitiveness, being curious. He says, we get excited about being blank, and there's a word missing there, because you've discovered something blank. Well, what are the two missing words? Well, it's being excited about being wrong because you've discovered something new. Well, that's not common in organizations. Getting excited about being wrong is not a quality that you'll hear about in most MBA programs. And yet it characterizes Apple because pushing the envelope, creating new stuff, creating breakthroughs, creating new business models requires trying new things. It requires being curious. It's a manifestation and expression of the innovation culture. And as Ive points out here, it's embodied in the Apple culture very, very well. And it characterizes what makes Apple a great company. Now, what do all these products have in common? Well, these are Apple products that failed. In other words, not only do we make mistakes and learn at the level of our teams and our product development work, but we put out products in the marketplace and they don't always succeed either, but we learn from all of them. So most companies that had this many failures, we would probably never have heard of them. We wouldn't remember them. But what do we remember from Apple? We remember its successes because it learned from its failures. All these qualities about collaboration, about learning, about the process of failure and learning from failure, those are important attributes of an innovation culture that any organization could strive to emulate. And what about where we innovate? What are the tools and methods that we use? Well, in this same quote from Ive that we saw just a moment ago, he says, we invest heavily in tools and processes because these are elements of the infrastructure that makes it possible for us to do great work. And lastly, when does Apple innovate? Well, Apple innovates pretty fast. So when is now? So these are the 6 questions that an innovation system must address. I introduced these questions to you in the prior chapter. And I said the innovation master plan is based on having systematic answers to these 6 questions. And my assessment is Apple actually has addressed all 6 quite well. So why does Apple innovate? That's their strategy. What do they innovate? They have a full portfolio of all 4 types of innovation. How does Apple innovate? Well, it drives a rigorous innovation process through design obsession. Who's innovating in Apple? That's the innovation culture. That's the learning mindset. It's pervasive throughout the organization. Where does Apple innovate? Well, Apple has an infrastructure, the tools and the networks of people who work together. And when does Apple innovate? Well, it's constant. So it's now and forever. So does Apple have an innovation master plan? Well, we would say, yes, Apple does absolutely have an innovation master plan. So let's go back to this comment from Jobs. He said, at Apple, there is no system to harness innovation. With all due respect to Jobs and his innovation genius, I don't think this is a true statement. we think that Apple definitely has a system to harness innovation. It may not be written down at Apple, but if we reverse engineer it by looking at all the things that they do by collecting information from a very wide variety of sources, as we've done for this case study, then we see quite clearly that Apple does have a system to harness innovation. And it matches up quite well with our framework, with the Innovation Master Plan framework. So it gives us confidence that we're on the right track. It gives us confidence that we've described a system that, when it's implemented well and rigorously, it really does work. It certainly works for Apple, one of the most valuable corporations in the world. We think it could work very well for you too. You may not be Apple, but your company can be a business model innovator, can be a breakthrough innovator, can apply incremental innovation to gain market share, can develop an innovation culture, can follow rigorous innovation processes, can implement the best innovation tools. So you can start right now, and that's what this course is all about.